Good afternoon. Thanks so very much to everyone for finding time on a Friday afternoon, a holiday at that, to join us. My name is Charles Waldheim. I'm chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, and on behalf of my colleague Raul Marotra, chair of Urban Planning and Design, and our dean Moise Mustafavi, we want to welcome you. I want to say just a couple of quick thanks and welcome everyone who's traveled to be here and join the conversation. Thanks to everyone in the front office, the LA UPD office, Nicole Sander, everyone else who managed to pull this together in very short order over the last several weeks. Thanks very much to all of our friends and colleagues, graduate students, faculty members. I'd like to acknowledge Peter Baldrick of the CGA. Thanks for being here, Peter, with some members of his team. And I also want to thank, of course, our participants and speakers. We have 6 extraordinarily talented emerging voices on a range of topics attended to geographic representation. So I feel very, very fortunate to be able to just say a couple of words of welcome and sit back and learn a lot over the course of the next several hours. The main body of the afternoon will be managed by 3 extraordinarily talented interlocutors. First, you'll be hearing from Paul Cody in just a minute. Paul Cody will be introducing and managing the first session. Then our own Neil Brenner will manage the introductions and serve as a discussant for the second section. And then Felipe Correa will join us just in a moment, and he will be introducing and serving as a discussant for the third section. In the short time that I've been in the school, I've come to know the culture here in which, before the school embarks on a faculty appointment or even a search, there's a habit of wanting to survey the field. And so we're here this afternoon really in a very informal, kind of lighthearted, kind of open-minded frame of mind to literally do that. We're using the rubric geographic representation, and by the end of the afternoon that will be wrong, I'm quite convinced. So it's one of my goals, is to come away with a new title and a new subtitle. We're calling it a colloquium in part to distinguish that it's not an open to the public event, and we haven't advertised this, although it has been circulated within the community, and we've had opened the doors to as many of our colleagues and friends as would find it interesting. Our goals are primarily to look at the history and future of what had been geographic information systems, and to study its recent past, but also look more broadly at disciplinary and practical concerns attendant to geographic representation. If we would have had this conversation maybe 4 or 5 decades ago, of course, it would have been a very different one. I'll say some more about that in the context of the Harvard GSD's engagements in these questions in just a minute. Maybe 25 years ago, it would have been easier to draw a distinction between GIS proper, let's call it, and the emergence of a couple of other discourses. On the one hand, 25 years ago, the emergence of what's come to be known as so-called critical GIS and various attendant subdisciplines. And equally, 25 years ago, we would have seen the beginnings of a discourse around mapping, coming largely from cultural geography and the reception of cultural geography in schools of architecture and design. 10 years ago, it strikes me that those separate and distinct strands could be more readily identified. That is, you could see something that looks like a legacy GIS piece that's fairly techy, that has much to do with a kind of positivist idea about mapping the world. We could have identified critical GIS and a range of other kind of emergent ways of thinking about the production and reception, history of science, history of technology. And at the same moment, the discourse around cultural geography and mapping in schools of design was buoyant, it was leavening. Right? But at the same moment, 10 years ago, at least from my own perspective, those discourses were largely discrete from one another. And I think what I've been learning the last several months reading into this, I'll be interested to hear what you think, is the inscrutability of overlap these days, and a really healthy, interesting, from my view, productive intersection and engagement between, on the one hand, techniques of production and reception, and equally critical understandings of reception and audience, leavened by the emergence of art and design design practices in which the making of maps or so-called new cartographies are ambient. It makes it, I think, a really timely question for us here in the school, and as we want to do more in this space going forward, this was the provisional structure that we came away with. We solicited recommendations both internally across campus, across North America, and the UK, and any one individual emerging voice who we heard from at least 3 people should be here were invited. And so we have an extraordinarily talented group with us. In the first session, under the provisional rubric Design, Mobility, and Ubiquity, meant to signal the kind of engagement increasingly with design questions and the engagement increasingly with questions of mobility and open sourcing of geospatial information, the session that Paul Cody will lead. We're very fortunate to have Mike Flaxman from that technical institute at the other end of Mass Ave, East Cambridge, as well as John Reeds from University College London and his work at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis. In the second session, led by Neil Brenner, under the rubric of Critical and Radical Cartographies, Matt Wilson is with us from the University of Kentucky, and he'll be sharing with us his view on the history and future of critical GIS and GIS studies more broadly. And Lizzie Mogul is with us, practice artist and editor and curator from New York, who will be speaking about the impact of experimental and radical cartography practices in art and culture. And then finally, the third session, led by Felipe Correa, under the rubric Mapping of New Geographies. We have Sarah Williams from Columbia and Maria Arcaro from the University of Michigan, speaking to, and in some ways inhabiting, that tradition of cultural geography practices within schools of design. Beyond that, the only other thing that I would say is I will encourage you to keep it brief and pithy, topical, informal, discursive, and let's have some fun. The piece that I have asked Paul to do is a brief retrospective analysis of the last several years, the last decade, something like this maybe, of these engagements and questions here in the GSD. And in order to set the table for that, I wanted to start by saying just briefly, we were very pleased recently around our 75th anniversary and around the 375th anniversary of the university to be engaged in a discussion with the university about what are the leading ideas that have emerged from the university over the course of those 3 3/4 centuries. And so in that conversation, we as a department in landscape architecture and as a school put forward a range of ideas that we feel have really changed the state of play, changed the game from our various disciplines. And one of those ideas, somehow, through some process, floated above the fold in the Gazette to be one of 12 ideas in 375 years from this university. So those 12 ideas are an amazing list, and they're online in the Gazette if you want to take a look. They include things like anesthesia for surgery, and the catcher's mask, and a range of other things that, while I'll leave aside the kind of curatorial choices about how they arrived at that list, I was very pleased to see that one of them, the only one from the history of the GSD, reflected this topic, that is the so-called invention of GIS here. As many of you know, of course, Harvard, in its wisdom, decided to get out of the business of geography in the 40s?
48.
Late 40s, I want to
48.
In that kind of American hubris that, well, we've won the war and freed the world and we've mapped everything, so why bother with that little department? Of course, the rebirth of geography here just a few years ago with the center as a part of the storyline. In 1965, the Laboratory for Computer Graphics was founded with a $1 million seed grant from the Ford Foundation. The lab was both an administrative unit of the Graduate School of Design and populated with members of faculty from urban planning and from landscape architecture. It was founded by Howard Fisher, and it occupied space at the basement of Memorial Hall. They coincidentally have office space just next to the Students for Democratic Society, so the SDS chapter in the late 60s, and the guys who would invent computer mapping and Harvard ComGIS were occupying the same space. I'm interested in this both in Fisher's leadership, the scale of the ambition, and also the emergence of two landscape architects. Carl Steinitz, a member of the landscape architecture faculty in 1967, who was engaged on the academic side, began offering design studios using computer mapping and SIMAP, among other platforms, in 1967. At the same time, Jack Dangerman joined the MLA program as a student. He was here 67, 69, and went on from his 2 years in the lab to found, of course, Esri. Now that's a history that many of you in the building and in the room know much more about than I do, but I wanted to just begin there and place it in that kind of intellectual genealogy, and then invite Paul to say something more about the more recent past of the GSD.
Well, thanks. When Charles asked me to be the discussant today for the first group of speakers, I went to the dictionary and looked it up. And as it happens, I get to set the context for the next two talks, but I also have license to be a little provocative. And so listen closely, and you might hear something provocative. It's too bad, first of all, I want to say that Steve Urban couldn't be here to present these remarks because he has a family arrangement in Montreal. But Stephen really is the best representative of a bridge between the Laboratory for Computer Graphics and our current situation. I started here at the GSD just as the lab was winding down in 1993, and I took over the desk of the last employee of the lab, John Korsenreicher. But you can see by walking around the studio that the vision of Howard Fisher and the pioneers of the lab lives on in the trays and also in the greater world of geospatial studies. The application of computers to understanding places is now everywhere. And it's, I think, part of this setting of the GSD and its uniqueness is owing to Bill Mitchell, who came here in 1985 as a professor of architecture, who really saw the, before mice, Macs, and menus, saw the power of ubiquitous computing and networked intelligence to transform the design professions. And so our computer lab is everywhere. It's on every desk. And if you haven't walked around the trays, I invite you to go take a look. After Mitchell left in 1992, completely during this time, actually, while Mitchell was operating, and as Carl mentioned even before, Carl Steinitz was innovating the use of computers for understanding space and landscape studies. To study the alternative futures of large regions of the country, he ever refined his framework for landscape design and analysis, attracting top PhD or doctoral students like Mike Flaxman, to create models that assemble real data and methods to embody the interdisciplinary systems and reflect the dynamic interaction of demographics, physical, and ecological, and even political and economic systems as they relate to change the landscape. What was infuriating about Carl's work is that he made it look so easy. And for those of us who actually were creating those models and bringing the data together, it's actually very hard to do. And like Bill, Carl insisted that the new methods not merely changed the way that individuals work in studio, but they transformed the intention of practice, and they developed new problem-solving strategies for specific places and times that engage decision makers, stakeholders, experts from different disciplines, and spheres of influence. And so we need to tip our hat to Carl and Bill. And now the age of ubiquitous computing has arrived everywhere. The assumption that each student will have a computer is no longer a distinction that we can claim here at the GSD. Yet we're still distinct in many ways. And we've helped to pull the design world forward in terms of innovative computing and design. But the gap between us and the rest of the world in this regard is shrinking. And so one of the questions we're here to ask is, which direction should we go? Of the many. And we need to go in many directions, obviously. And so this is why we're here. And so as a means of introducing the first two speakers, I'm now going to say something to spur your imagination. We're doing an excellent job here at the GSD of integrating computing in the traditional design studio curriculum. The École des Beaux-Arts has been electronically accelerated and enhanced. The tradition, inspired so long ago, have been facilitated by the use of computers. We now have new ways to create images and maps and physical models using data and computers. And in that grand old tradition, each term, selected artifacts are selected for printing in books and now posted on websites for people to look at. But the bulk of this work is carried out of the studio in a spectacular train of dumpsters every semester. Now, I'm not saying that our maps and images and physical models are garbage, even though they end up that way. The trouble is, or the power of maps and physical models and images is far from depleted, and there are many things that we can't express. There are many very important things that we can't express without them. However, all I'm saying is that the bulk of the work and understanding that we develop in the studio and that we bring to bear on place-based design questions is very difficult to carry forward and reuse. And so, in practice, it's easier to simply start over from scratch each term. So, our two speakers are going to talk about some new approaches to this and new points of view on this question. And I'm going to introduce a new term called geodesign. It's actually not my term. It's a new term that's out there in the field that's been coined recently to describe the potential to merge conceptual models and data to develop coherent and useful tools for incorporating the knowledge from multiple disciplines to understand the places in new ways. In effect, geodesign is the melding of Mitchell and Steinitz. The network intelligence of Mitchell and the systems thinking of Steinitz. And the reason that we aren't in geodesign heaven right now is that this new way of working can't be brought about merely by making images or inventing new terms for things. This geodesign ideal can only be brought to fruition by working together across disciplines to develop new shared conceptions of landscape that are reusable, that we can encode and exchange in systematic and meaningful ways. It's not a historical fluke that the Graduate School of Design is a perfect laboratory for studying these issues. So the question for all of you to ponder when you're listening to these two speakers today is, what are the new directions that we as a school should pursue to continue to lead in the field of design computing? And so I'm really happy, and I think that we've got two great speakers to sort of like chime in on this. And I know that this may not be the question that you intended to address, but these are questions that we might be thinking about for the discussion afterwards. And so this first speaker is a friend of mine, Michael Flaxman. He earned his Doctor of Design degree here at the GSD in 2004, and is now a professor of urban technologies and information systems at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Mike worked very closely with Carl Steinitz, as I mentioned, and his work is concerned with broad-scale landscape planning, developing models for solving real problems of alternative futures for regions. Probably he'll tell us more about that. And so the second speaker, I'll announce after Mike's talk.
Can everybody hear me okay, or should I? Mic. I'll sit use the mic. So it's a pleasure to be back here at the GSD. I don't get down the street as much as I ought, so thanks for the invitation. I was indeed here for quite a few years, basically as a doctoral student with Carl Steinitz, which, as I was explaining to some of my colleagues, involved a lot of globe-trotting and carrying bags and making technology look easy. That experience was really pretty formative for me, actually, in how I approached a lot of these issues, because it meant that I had to be doing similar tasks in design over and over again, but supporting wildly different studio projects, for instance. And so it really was what motivated me to think, what can I do that's going to work for Beit Shan in Israel and going to work for Berlitz in Germany? And how can we make this easier than starting over again from scratch each time? So I'm not going to show you actually any projects today. I have more kind of a conceptual talk because I want to try and convince you of a couple of points that were the key ideas that I came out of the GSD with and brought in part of the bio that Paul didn't mention, but I worked for ESRI. Actually, I'll tell a story because it's a GSD story. So I was working on the computer one day upstairs, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder and asked what I was doing, and I explained what I was doing, and it turned out to be Jack Dangerman. And so when I left the GSD, I went to work as the industry manager for, it was officially called Architecture, Engineering, and Construction. I shortened that to be design at ESRI. And I got to work on a project that I proposed, which is what came to be known as the Geodesign project. So Jack Dangerman coined that term. I've been saying geospatial design, and he said, no, that's too GSD, it's geodesign. Very wise man. So I want to show you kind of the concepts behind it, but first off, my definition, there are now a lot of them out there, but I thought we needed a kind of design and planning method that more tightly coupled the creation of design proposals with impact simulations that were informed by geographic context. And so that was what I thought was the common thread across all of the Carl Steinitz studios and other projects that we did, is that we used a really classic formulation that was a good formulation, came out of the 1960s, environmental impact statement kind of era. And it said, well, in a really complex, large regional plan, you don't have one form of evaluation, you have 12 or 15. And you need to be set up for that at the outset. And if you think seriously about any large place for more than a few moments, there are hundreds of possible designs and policies, and they interact in really complicated ways. So the graphic for the conference is quite appropriate in showing, thousands of design possibilities. That's kind of the starting point. Lots of design possibilities, lots of need to evaluate. And in most of the work I did with Carl, there was both internal design evaluation and then external evaluation in the form of formalized expertise. So we did projects with hydrologists, with historians, with archaeologists, and organizing those large teams of people really brought to my head the importance of design iteration, but not design iteration within one person's head, design iteration with 15 people trying to work as closely as possible to get a better design. So basically identified these problems. There was, and this is not novel by any means, but there were obvious disciplinary and professional divisions. In particular and fundamentally, there was and still largely is, a separation of design from evaluation. So some kind of, the more formal and larger process you get, the more separated those things are. And I guess the environmental impact statements that nobody now reads, that are phone book size, environmental evaluations are probably, to me, the epitome of this. So really, if you have a feedback from the draft EIS back to design, it's 12 months or 18 months and hugely formalized. And so I love the original idea of EIS, which is kind of do multiple alternatives, evaluate them, pick the best one. But that got ensconced in this really legalistic, long time frame, one draft DIS, one done project, and we kind of lost the idea of design iteration in there, that you could have design informed by evaluations. When I worked at ESRI, I noticed that not only were a lot of design workflows separated from the scientific or regulatory, but that also was endemic in construction and facilities management. So you had a lot of, for instance, innovation about energy that wasn't making it back from people that manage buildings and know how buildings actually function over long time periods back into the design professions. Why? Because we didn't have good mechanisms for closing that loop. So the common issue there is the lack of information flow back to design, and that leads obviously to bad design in the sense that important considerations are either ignored or slow and expensive workflows from the long deferred evaluation. So that in the world of professional practice, is emblematic in the thousands of change orders on a typical project. So why are we seeing projects, any large project, having hundreds to thousands of change orders? Well, something isn't working about the design process between disciplines if we're ending up with that. So as an example, just imagine, and I'm being pretty hypothetical here, but a typical green neighborhood design project, designers probably need feedback in at least a half a dozen realms that you can think about. So they want some information from the sciences about biodiversity, hydrology, erosion. They need to know about regulatory mechanisms, zoning, emergency planning, etc. And beyond the kind of regulatory requirements, there are a whole series of best practices, codes, increasingly formalized. And their designs are going to be evaluated against all of those things eventually. And the question that brings up is, okay, so when are those evaluations needed? And my argument is basically the sooner the better, that cycle time really does matter. And that basic screening and vulnerability is often sufficient in early design. So this kind of notion that you go all the way to final design, then do an evaluation, is really part of the problem. If you have lighter weight forms of screening and vulnerability, you can get information back into the design cycle much more quickly. Why bother wasting your time considering infeasible options? What people want that are working on the design elements is as quickly as possible to get rid of the ideas that aren't going to work. And that leads to the big how question, and I'll talk about that in a couple ways. I was thinking about this the other day when Steve Jobs passed, and one of the things that made him a great person in the design and design computing professions, one of many, was his kind of fundamental respect for the arts, but his ability to integrate that with technology. And the simplest example I could think of that was his respect for fonts and typography. So in the early days when he started working with computers, every computer had its own single monospace, god-awful ugly font, and usually green on black. And he looked at typography and the history of the arts in that area, and he took them seriously, and he respected it. And what he did was he came up with the notion of a font in digital format. Now that notion had existed already, but non-technically. And fundamentally what he did is he figured out a way to have a dual representation. And to me that's the fundamental innovation which I've leveraged a lot myself. And that is that a font is a kind of style that's applied to the same basic text. In technical terms, you've separated out the data from the representation. And once you make that jump, you can do a lot of things. So you can have a font that looks good on a cell phone and looks good on an immersive reality screen. You've separated out the representation in a way that allows you to make the representation flexible without losing the connection to the underlying meaning. And so that's my non-technical version of the technical term semantics. A lot of the mechanism that I worked on for geodesign was based on that fundamental concept, that we need to figure out a way to take design elements and keep semantics independent of the representations, so that then we can pass data between ourselves in different forms and get the advantage of the semantics remaining constant while allowing for different professional representations. So for example, a hydrologist and a landscape planner might be working on the same project together, and they may have a need to represent a stream. If they don't have a joint representation, then they're going to go back and forth a lot. So that they each bring different things to the problem, but the hydrologist may need to evaluate the floodplain, for instance, and the designer may have a lot of other criteria. So it's really important to develop shared representations. And the second concept is basically, I'm going to show some architectures in a minute, but basically to build links to evaluation models directly into design environments. So this notion that a design should be done, handed off in a paper document, and then evaluated, I find really ridiculously archaic at this point, but it still occurs every day. We want to have hooks when we're designing things that give evaluations as soon as possible. And that means in early formulation of design, and mid-stage design, and in final design. So how do you do that? There are a number of technical means. You can do it all on one desktop computer. I tried that for many of the projects done here, actually, and melted down a lot of computers. I convinced myself that in reality the best way to do this is to reconsider both design representations and evaluations as web services. So that's an emerging paradigm across a lot of fields in technology. And what it does is it allows you essentially to evaluate things in parallel. So the aforementioned stream redesign, for instance, can be rendered visually and can be evaluated hydrologically. And those things don't have to happen sequentially on the same machine. They can happen in parallel on different machines, and in fact in different offices. So I think it's really important to latch on to this notion of chainable web services because it serves us as a profession really well. So here's a kind of graphical version of what motivated this, or how I saw the state of play when I first went to ESRI. I was working on a lot of projects where the initial medium was paper or trace. And so there was a magical design process with a cartoon bubble there. But the immediate design artifact was paper or trace. And that led to really rapid workflow for the designer at the early phase of design. But the dilemma was and still is that then invokes on the technical back end 3 or 4 annoying steps that nobody likes to have to deal with, but are actually fundamental then to creating the bottom right usable GIS features, something that's computable. And those steps are basically, first of all, to get the graphics into digital format. They may or may not be. You might start with an Illustrator file or a Photoshop file, so you're starting at step 2 and it's digital, but it's not georeferenced anything, right? And so then, once it's digital, the next step is georeferencing. And that is still done today with the same stupid methods from 15 and 20 years ago. Basically, you find points of correspondence between your drawing and something on the ground. And it's tedious. Nobody likes to do it. But it's not automated under the current systems, not well automated. Then, in traditional GIS, you have to do a database creation task that's independent of your drawing task. And you essentially have to create an attribute table. And so that's the point in GIS where you introduce semantics, the notion that each object has a category. And that's necessary in GIS for the technology then to be able to distinguish usefully between those 2 categories. So the GIS can't tell that blue is different than green. Right? It fundamentally doesn't understand a graphic representation. It's only when you give it an attribute table and link those that it can actually make usable information. And so I was really familiar with this workflow from thousands of studio projects, not thousands, but quite a few. And my question to myself is, how do we skip all those middle bits and create a representation that lets you directly create semantically rich features? And the reasoning actually came from a charrette I did with Parsons Brinkerhoff in Baltimore doing some urban redevelopment. And you know, here, top 10 engineering firm in 2006 or so, busted out the trace, and they got nice interaction and really rapid feedback from the stakeholders for the early phase getting stuff on trace. And then they had a room full of people digitizing those plans, trying to interpret them, trying to put them into some digital format, and getting half of it wrong. And it was just a really ugly process, but it was one that was quite familiar. And so I thought, well, if we make a digital environment that's compelling enough to designers as a design tool, that they are motivated to draw on top of a base map that's already georeferenced, then we've solved the first battle. We can get free georeferencing. Nobody has to go in and do that after the fact. And then the second idea was basically, I'll stay on the concept for a second, was let's respect colors for a second and say that when somebody picks up a brush and uses a different color, they likely want that thing to be a different category or different meaning. We don't even know what the meaning is yet, it's just two colors. But if they wanted it to be the same thing, it would probably be one color. So I picked up on that idea and came up with a notion of automatically associating attributes with pen colors. Not a great innovative concept, but it was radical at ESRI because in the GIS world, the notion is symbology, thank you, comes last. And so turning that around and saying, no, the pen comes first, we're going to rejigger the technology so that you don't think of it as editing, you think of it as creating. And use that to force attributes forward is kind of the key idea. So that led to a few prototypes and eventually out the pipeline 5 years later, some minor changes in the current version of the software. I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm almost out of time, but the second major concept I alluded to earlier was basically, okay, you've got now a Geo Sketching environment where you've got semantics and the machine knows something about the difference between a lake and a building. What do you do with that? And the second idea was to use, to go from a model in which you have one drawing that goes out for professional evaluation to multiple offices or specialists in an office, gets done as separate impact statement processes, and gets reintegrated in the designer's head in a slow design evaluation cycle. And to put that into a web framework designed to shorten that cycle time as much as possible. So the idea is that then sorry, that's missing a piece, that the concept sketch actually can be evaluated because it's a web service in terms of biodiversity and in terms of water quality separately on different machines. And that feedback can occur rather immediately. So, sorry for the cheesy graphics on that. I was feeling whimsical last night. So there are a number of examples I'm not going to go into now in the interest of time, but there are existing services out there that are emblematic of this. One that I should give credit to is Autodesk has a Green Building Services web service environment. You do a design in BIM, it does the evaluation as a web service and tells you what the energy impacts are, and you can do scenarios indeed. So Community Viz is a GIS-based version, very similar. FEMA has a hazard impact modeling system, very similar. My sense is that there are a lot of such environments out there already, but they're all specialized. And so the idea behind the Geodesign Initiative at ESRI was really to make a platform for that so that it could be broader. I got, in my judgment, a third of the way through that. So the ArcSketch stuff that got into the current software basically does the geosketching part, but not the evaluation. The tools aren't there yet, but the concepts are getting across. And Jack Dangerman, to his credit, has broadened out the concept, brought in a lot of people. Along the way, the concept got a lot vaguer, but that's inevitable. So in conclusion, I think we're not up to critical mass yet, but I still believe in this as an idea. And I'm here because I think we're missing leadership on the design school side, and I'll throw stones at my own institution as well as this one, in that there's a real need to generate professional grade design representations that are geocoded and semantically rich. And I'm going to end on with showing you a map, which is indeed a non-conventional map because it's an immersive, interactive, real-time display of vegetation. But each of those trees and each of the buildings and each element in the landscape is indeed part of a GIS. And this is not my work, this is Philip Carr, who's a colleague in Germany. And a final quote from Jack Dangerman: "We need a new approach that synthesizes and brings together design with science with technology." So I think that's still where we are and what we need to work on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm going to torture my introduction just a little bit and say that if Mike Flaxman is the most Steinitzian of the two speakers we have today, then maybe Jonathan Reeds is the most Mitchell-like. John, I don't know John, but I did read his bio on the web, and he works at University College London and is a specialist in big data, using the traces of societal and information or administrative data to learn new things about the way the world works. And I'll let Jonathan, he can probably do a better job of explaining that than I just did. Thanks for coming.
Well, I think it's funny that Carl is sort of this unspoken presence. Well, no, very much spoken presence, not physical presence here. Because I can assure you he's alive and well, and he constantly shows up at our seminars in London. So all I need now is for somebody to ask a difficult question, and then I'll feel right at home.
That'll come.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with actually, it's actually a restatement of something that Mike had put up as his first slide, which was he defined geodesign as a design and planning method which tightly couples the creation of design proposals with impact simulations informed by geographic context. And that's certainly something that I'm very much in line with. I think where we might differ, without saying disagree, is what for us is the context. And certainly without meaning to in the least take away from what Mike does, to my mind what he's tackling is the tactical level, so the actual implementation, whereas I think of what I do as being more sort of strategic or structural. So a lot of what you're going to see from me is design probably in its sort of absolute broadest sense. So for me, the way I came to this research actually was by working a lot with mobile phone data, and that really, and kind of the way that Manuel Castells put it, is this space of flows. And so we're increasingly at a point where space is structured by, by material, sort of physical flows, people flows, and increasingly digital flows. And all of those are sort of feeding into and interacting with one another. And those flows impact the local context and therefore affect kind of the opportunities for development, what a suitable design context, suitable design solution might be, patterns of future growth in sort of geographical areas. And so understanding how those flows play out sort of over time and space is, I think, really essential for the future of sort of the various spatial practices, be they architecture, planning, landscape architecture, things like that. So, and actually, I realized I didn't actually say what this was showing. This is, for those of you who know London, this is London's overground and underground maps as measured through the Oyster card, which is a sort of a unique, TfL has made it as difficult as possible for you to travel anonymously through the system. And I've been lucky enough to get access to this data. And so this is looking at entries and exits at different stations during the morning rush hour. So in this case, greens are exits and reds are entries. And so, right here, without my having to leave my desk, I can, intuitively we know, a lot happens in the center. People flow in from the commuter belt. But without having to leave my desk, it's now possible to actually look at the size of those flows, kind of what the relationships are, the network structures that emerge from that. And so this is really kind of this is where the data-led part of my work comes in. And that's what I'm going to try and develop and hopefully get you to think that it's quite interesting. So turning now to, as I said, data for me is the origin of the kind of work that I do. And I think one of the challenges that we're increasingly facing is that attribute data of the sort that is natural to, say, ArcGIS is very good at explaining kind of static environments. It's much harder to work through dynamic environments. And so, as somebody put it at a conference I went to, the census only tells me where people sleep. And so I'm really interested in what about where they work? How do they get from where they sleep to where they work? What happens when they go out at night? And so this map here is actually a regionalization of Britain using the landline telecommunications network. So this is, if we look at the geography of talk, does it map onto, those historical geographies of sort of linguistic variation, communities, and how do those sort of scale up? And again, it's interesting to compare these to the historical counties, and you find interesting correspondences, but I always find the differences to be rather intriguing, and especially in this case, if you take Wales, North Wales is sort of bonded with Liverpool, Manchester, and Central Wales has this very strong communication flow with Birmingham. So even though Wales is very has a strong linguistic cultural tradition, in fact, from the standpoint of their interaction, we've got this sort of striation north to south. So before I go any further, big data, open data, what do I mean by those terms? I think they're orthogonal. Big data is not necessarily open data. They're both inherently subjective. So my sort of working definition of big data is any data set that is sufficiently large to require sort of a storage and analysis strategy. As in, you can't just throw it on a desktop computer and expect it to give you meaningful answers. And by that definition, as sort of computing technology progresses, the definition of big data gets larger and larger. So that previous slide, the regionalization of Britain, was based on the aggregation of 8 billion individual phone calls between points both within Britain and outside Britain. Open data, of course, may be a little more familiar to all of you. I tend to think of that as being partly a rhetorical approach, as in data should be open, should be accessible, because it empowers people, it empowers scientists, and it empowers policymakers. But I'm not. That, to be honest, is not somewhere where I particularly consider most of my work to be right now. Although it's certainly somewhere I'd like to kind of move into. So right now I work predominantly with large closed data sets, and I'd like to sort of see some. Hopefully, over time, those closed data sets will move into the open category. But there's a lot of regulatory hurdles to cross through that. So an example, big data, I already said. So this is, we can start out with just simply aggregate measures, without a spatial component, or with an implicit spatial component. So this is looking at the percentage of international phone calls that were connected to London and the sort of top 10 and bottom 10 British cities versus the number of active phone lines in each of those areas. So London, although it has only 23% of Britain's sort of active phone lines, from this data set, was responsible for 36% of its international calls. So you might think, great, that reflects exactly what I know. London is, the global city. But the interesting thing about big data is that when you're dealing with big numbers, normalization can change the picture quite a bit. So this is now the top 10 and bottom 10 on a per capita basis. And suddenly the picture starts to look a little more complicated. London's dropped to number 3. And for those of you who aren't familiar with British geography, number 2 there, Slough, was the site of the original version of The Office. So this is not an area that people think of as being international in its outlook and its engagement with the rest of the world, but on a per capita basis, it actually is. And then the next thing about this is that the top 10 cities here are all based within a much larger geographic region. They're not all connected directly to London, but they're all within sort of, say, about 150 miles of London. And so this is where this kind of larger strategic context comes into play, and I'll dig into that in some of the subsequent slides. So this is now, if we take each of those individual measures and spatialize them, this is what we start to get. So this was work that I did for my PhD, looking at industrial geographies. So I wanted to understand essentially globalization. So this is taking large volume callers, so in other words, people that we suspect are not individual households, and looking at the relative intensity of international calling. And this reproduces something that's actually fairly well known, which is what my supervisor, Peter Hall, called back in actually the 80s, the Western Wedge, which was the old sort of defense research and development corridor to the west of London, centered largely on Reading, kind of, and sort of in a westward arc. Up around Cambridge is also now associated with sort of bioscience, things like that. And then this sort of smattering of very intensely internationalized areas, which are primarily about research and development activity. And so when we talk about London, you know, and thinking of that as the center of this globalized sort of industrial activities, in fact, quite a misleading picture. So that's why, you know, that's why I was looking at this larger geography here. And we can also, you know, flipping it on its head and taking domestic callers. So this is the Hindi population in London as collected from the census data, and superimposed on that is, so this is looking at the intensity of calling to and from India. So we can also use this to, it's not just about kind of the, you know, the industry, we can also use it to research these kind of more human geographies of, you know, of migrant, you know, sort of migration, you know, human migration and sort of people flows. So it's not just about kind of those big informational flows. One of the other things about these large data sets is they also have quite intense, they often have quite high resolution temporal data as well, which we can use to look at a single place over time. So these are two maps, two line charts from taken again, now we're going back to the tube system. And this is normalized against what's the overall activity in the tube system on a daily basis. So Canary Wharf, which is kind of the sort of the secondary center for financial activity, you can see by the sort of the dip in the morning is actually sort of pulling in people, or rather not contributing people to the system. And then in the evening, when work wraps up, obviously it's pushing commuters back into the overall commuter system. And I mean, the one thing that I was rather disappointed to see from this is how early the bankers get to go home. I think they should be staying a lot later to work. But you know, and then turning now to Camden Town, where you know what you can really see from this difference is if you want to go out on a weekend, Camden Town is the place to go. There's that nice little rush of people trying to catch the last tube home, but it's clearly like a very, you know, there the dynamic is about the evening. Canary Wharf is much more of a commuter. Sort of people traveling for work and then you leave and go somewhere else, whereas Camden Town is much more dynamic in that context. When we bring these two together, this is when I think we really start to get, you know, the sort of more interesting and the more subtle findings from sort of big data sets. So this is that other institution down the road. Looking at here, this is Wi-Fi usage. So what we have is on the sort of the upper part of this image is MIT's 3 formal classifications of space on their campus. And what we found was when we applied a sort of a computational process to the pattern of Wi-Fi connections over time, we actually found that there were 5 functional uses. So even though, you know, from MIT's standpoint, there's academic, there's, you know, research, and there's sort of academic, residential, and kind of service. Really, there's these public spaces that are used differently from, you know, the other spaces with which they share kind of a building. And this, you know, although this is a very small example, I think that really kind of communicates the power of looking at behavior rather than just treating sort of static attributes in space. So when we start thinking about what do people do in these spaces, how do they move through them, how do they interact with other spaces, that for me is the really exciting thing to look at. So is this a geography 2.0? Well, I picked that term for my abstract because as I was thinking about the connections between what I do and design, I was thinking a little bit of Web 2.0, which is, you know, obviously very much about interaction, the dynamic component, sort of mashups, that sort of thing, and also the fact, of course, that some of it, frankly, is a lot of hype. So I think, you know, it's exciting. It's not, you know, the all-seeing, all dancing solution to problems, but you know, in this case, so this map is kind of the synthesis of my earlier research, which was looking at kind of areas that were intensely internationalized around London versus, so we have a difference here between global business and local business. And I think, you know, although a lot of these maps were all coming out of a mixture of kind of ArcGIS and Illustrator and related tools, I think one of the other really exciting things about this data-driven domain is that in fact a lot of the work is being done by amateurs, which I mean in historical context, so people who are passionate, who care, but who don't have a formal training in cartographic representation or you know, these various other tools, and a lot of it has a political point. And I think that's, you know, so it's kind of funny that we go from these sort of massive databases to people who are really trying to accomplish very specific or you know, or less specific political agendas, whether it's about you know, economic development or social justice. I think so there's an interesting connection. We've almost gone so far in each direction that there's a kind of hookup around the back. So taking you know, taking 3 examples that have nothing to do with me. This is work that's been done by other people in my lab. And so there's the London bike share map, which a guy named Ali does, and he's got these maps which are they're basically soft real-time maps of bike share schemes from all over the world. And he's done it through a mixture of sort of accessing APIs, but also sort of screen scrapes and things like that. And the great thing about this is he did this sort of, again, from his desk. He didn't, you know, go and sort of arrange access to this with each bike scheme operator. But we happen to know from his having received an email from a scheme operator that they're actually using this internally to monitor the status of their own situation. And so that's sort of the opportunity, I think, of especially of open data, and to a lesser extent of big data, is for people to kind of come at things from a slightly different angle and produce visualizations, you know, relying on their own experience that might actually be better than those sort of canonical, formal tools that might be used in-house. And in fact, and again, linking this back to sort of the political aspect, we also, Ali's also received cease and desist letters from another scheme operator because people in those cities had started using Ali's maps to say, why is our scheme being so badly administered? So rather than engage with on that level, the operator decided, you know, no, I just don't want to have to deal with this. So I think there, you know, there's that, and that represents also kind of partly one of the challenges, I think, is there's an ambivalent relationship, you know, amongst academics and amongst, you know, industry to opening data up and making it available. But I do think that the promise is really that, you know, we can have discussions around much richer insight into what people are doing, how they're doing it, how they're moving around through the city. This is a visualization of telecommunications data. This is domestic telecommunications. And what's interesting to me about this map is the Thames acts as a barrier to communication. So the sort of the linkages along the north side of the Thames and the south side of the Thames are much stronger than the linkages across the Thames. So even though it doesn't cost anymore to call across the river, the fact is the way that we think about these spaces is clearly still embodied in this behavioral data. So the ability to get at that kind of, that nuance of how we think and how we behave through these massive data sets is, I think, is quite exciting. So trying to pull this all together, you know, my feeling is that, you know, design work, geographic representation, I think really benefits from being informed by this understanding of sort of the socioeconomic flows that underpin, you know, contemporary life. And so I would see kind of the smarter city, which is the sort of term that's on everybody's lips, at least in my discipline right now, my area right now, is I see it as kind of an integration of data and design with a kind of a real-time feedback. So empowering people to see what the situation is and respond to it in some kind of meaningful time frame. So I wanted to finish up with, I was asked to be provocative, so this is my attempt. This is a map of London in 1870. And so, you know, it's, you know, fairly recognizable as central London. And the reason is, if I put the 2010 roadmap on top, aside from, you know, some sort of registration issues, the fact is that these spaces are still the same. So that even though the built environment might have been completely transformed, the spaces through which people flowed, through which goods flowed, and increasingly along which information flows have remained constant over hundreds of years. If I could have found something earlier, I probably would have been able to show the exact same thing. So as a final sort of provocation, I think we need to think about the negative spaces as well as kind of positive ones that you'll all be creating. That's it.
Well, thank you. And now as discussant, I get to ask the first couple of questions. And naturally, I'll bring it back to my original framing of the problem, which is that I think both of you have looked at different slices of the same problem. That is, developing shared conceptions of places that we can use to compare one place with another, one time with another, in ways that will help us understand the way the world works. But you both, in your different slices, have highlighted different aspects of the problems and opportunities. Jonathan, on the one hand, using ubiquitous censored data, has extremely detailed information with nationwide coverage and very uniform semantics, which, as we can see, leads to very interesting and provocative maps. Whereas I think on Mike's slice of the problem, and Mike has highlighted the fact that using the traces of administrative records and scientific data that are collected in a very non-uniform way is grappling with this problem of fragmented semantics. Data that are non-uniform semantically that need to be put together in a coherent way. And so I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts about when these opportunities on the one hand of ubiquitous data with uniform semantics starts to come into the world of problem solving on a local level with local problems and local knowledge.
First.
Anyone? First. And you don't have to. You can pass. You can both pass if you like, because I'm sure somebody else has got an easier question.
Actually, since would it make sense for you guys to come to the front?
Yeah, no.
Sure.
Sure. Well, I think my talk tended to focus on the big data dimension, where I think kind of getting those findings, communicating them to the public, is actually one of the challenges. So making this kind of here's the greater Southeast relevant to someone who lives in Slough is a very difficult proposition. It does work much better at the kind of the strategic policy level. I think the open data side is where things start to get quite interesting, and the increasing availability of mapping tools that sit outside, that don't have licensing fees. I mean, whether, I would think of something as like Grass GIS as having quite a high sort of adoption threshold, but if you take a tool like processing or something like that, or Google Maps, or actually even better, OpenStreetMap, there the sort of the threshold to people ramping up their awareness and their understanding about their environment, what those changes might mean, is much lower. And I think for me, open data is ultimately where we get the linkage between kind of the local and the global or international.
Yeah, and as you may know, Britain is the UK is a particularly bad place to try to find open data.
I think that was true historically. I think it's changed a lot. Geographical information is still, there's still some issues there, although I do think that OpenStreetMap substitutes fantastically for, the privileged access constraints. But, you have, data.london.gov.uk or something, which actually has and deliberately makes available to the wider public for nothing more than a registration, all kinds of data about what's happening in London. It's updated on a regular basis. Transport for London is also increasingly making various types of data, not necessarily at the level at which I'm able to engage with it, but certainly sort of sample data sets around tube usage, and the bike share scheme again has been very supportive of development, this sort of proliferation, almost an ecology of information, or of sort of geographically influenced or aware visualizations. So I think it's changed.
Oh, good.
Is what I would say.
Good news.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I've fought through data issues worldwide. But I guess I do have a focus, and to be a little provocative, my sense is in professional practice, especially in the US, you can assume a tremendous amount of data that is open. And so a lot of my work focuses on exactly the semantic issue, because it's not a data access issue to us, it's a lack of semantic compatibility. So for example, we have not one but 4 different vegetation mapping schemes in the US. They're all open, they don't talk to each other, and the categories don't correspond. That's a semantic problem, it's not a data access or openness problem. You can get all of those data on the web. But going back to the ARC Sketch semantics issue, I mean, this is a really serious issue in terms of how those taxonomies and shared representations get developed over time. And I always think about it as the green roof problem. Namely, we've got formal taxonomies, and where those are accepted, and all the vegetation experts say that it's mixed conifer oak, and that has some technical meaning, and everybody agrees to it, fine. Then you've got a joint semantics, and there's only a transfer issue or a technology issue. But where you have innovation, which the design professions are the nexus of, you have people breaking categories all the time, and you want them to be. And so how do you get the ability to talk about green roofs propagated around the world when that's not in the National Vegetation Classification, and it's not in the National Roofers Association classification, for sure. And yet it's a really important concept. So the dilemma is that the formal tools we have for trading taxonomies don't do it. And the design tools we have for inventing new stuff don't do it either, because they're idiosyncratic representations. And you kind of want to have some bridging. There are a few interesting things on, there's been a lot of work on folksonomies, which are essentially shared Web 2.0 construction of taxonomies. And so if you think back to, I don't know, the MIT usage case example, well, you've come up now with an interesting new taxonomy for describing that space. Now, how do we propagate that in a way that somebody else looking at a campus in Wisconsin or Bangalore can take that and readily apply that concept to a completely different space? So there we have, to me that's the gist of the issue. How do you maintain the innovation, get new things coming from new data sources, and yet also then share a concept across cultures, across nations, across data sets? That's something that the current semantic web is trying to address, but it's certainly not there yet. So there's a bunch of really important work there. Because if we get that wrong, we locked ourselves in as kind of bureaucrats of data, that we're only accepting to share data that has an established taxonomy. And no designer is going to agree to that, I hope. On the other hand, the Tower of Babel is my real fear also, that designers' work tends to be paid less attention to when it's seen as separate from the process. And so the ability to have a shared representation that's useful to a designer and a civil engineer, I think is really important for that reason, because otherwise we've professionally marginalized ourselves. So that's my concern, is how to maintain those flows between professional practices, plural, and then, and I think John's work is showing we've got a whole new set of data streams coming at us, and it's by no means certain that we have the right representations of any of this stuff. So it's an exciting time, and I'm hoping, because we have to reinvent this stuff, we can take the opportunity to reinvent it in a way the next generation of spatial tools hopefully will deal with time, for instance, in a more sophisticated manner than the last generation. I think that probably is going to be one of the single most important changes, honestly, because most of my career, the first 20 years of my career, we're lucky to get one GIS data set for one snapshot randomly in time. And now we've got longitudinal data sets, every 10 minutes. So that's a huge difference. And it's not clear to me, which tools you would want to be able to handle that, because in some cases you want to be in the spatial domain, some cases the temporal domain, some cases the combination. So I'm by no means certain that GIS is a single answer. On the other hand, it is an integrating technology, so it's got a couple of the pieces in it.
And so the answer is, in terms of what direction should we go here in the GSD, I think from both the respondents, we have the problem and the solution. We're very good at inventing terms here at the school, and we can become much more sophisticated in developing a vocabulary of tools to describe places precisely that we can all share, that will make our work integrate and interoperate. So that's my answer, and now it's time for you to ask your questions. Step right up. Yes?
Yeah, about your talk, specifically about big data, I'm just wondering to what extent you have explored how we can use this big data set to discover new kind of space, for example. And I have in mind the idea of serendipity, which is a term that is really, up to date. So I'm just wondering what is your feeling about this idea that is really related to the derive of Guy Debord and the experimental space and psychogeography.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different things. So one of the direction in which I'm pushing, for instance, the work that I'm doing with the TFL data is to dig into what happens when there's an unusual event, whether it's, how do people act when, a station is closed for safety reasons or a line breaks down. And so that's a kind of unfortunate sort of serendipity, if you will, or in terms of, an unfortunate surprise is perhaps a better way to look at that. But when I think trying to move towards more the individual level and how individuals are sort of represented informationally, there's two interesting things. One is that we're taken in aggregate, we're a lot less creative and different than we think we are. So what you tend to see is that lots of people do what you do, no matter what kind of data you're looking at. So there's a paper that a friend of mine who's now at IBM worked on, where they looked at the likelihood that if two people called each other, that they would then be meeting physically as best they could tell from the data within a certain amount of time. And you find that there's a very predictable relationship between sort of the frequency and the duration of calls and the likelihood that those people will be within at least the same calling cell. So there's actually, in a sense, there's a lot less, on a systemic level, there's a lot less serendipity than you think. That said, I guess I tend to view big data as a platform for making it possible for people to interact in the ways that they want. So understanding, so if we can make, for instance, the transportation system work better in terms of, this person, we've got a huge group of people who have to go hugely out of their way in order to get to work. Then we have an access to opportunity issue. There's also, there's some work that was done by Nathan Eagle and some researchers at BT, at which they found they were basically able to reproduce Granovetter's social network analysis on the national scale and find that the shape of your social network in terms of its diversity is still very strongly correlated with your access to opportunities. It's not that, for instance, people from deprived communities use the phone a lot less. They use it just as much, but that sort of closed calling circle is still very prevalent. And so understanding those issues creates the opportunity for policy and design solutions that will allow people, hopefully, to access those resources that are currently being denied them. I don't think that necessarily quite answers your question, but that's sort of how I think about the problem.
So this is maybe a more general question for today, but it's already provoked by these two presentations, and it's particularly provoked by what John said, but it would be interesting to hear what you think as well, Mike. I mean, I'm interested in the relationship between all these data sets and theory, because it seems to me it's, we have all these amazing data sets that are emerging. We have all these new technologies for analyzing the data, and you can, crunch the numbers and generate amazing representations, and it's impressive. But at the end of the day, I mean, to formulate it maybe too polemically, but just for the sake of getting this question on the table, isn't that ultimately a descriptive exercise? In other words, unless you have, I mean, you said a little bit about your dissertation research, John, which is obviously motivated by a theoretical question about the geographies of globalization and global city formation. So clearly you're also interested in sort of theoretical questions, and that motivates the way in which you mobilize your data. But I think that I'm sort of trying to raise a more general question about, I mean, really for the day, because we have all of these data sets, and it's complicated. It's obviously very complicated to make sense of the data. But like, unless you have some broader political, normative, practical, theoretical question that's explicitly on the table, you can just kind of explore and make, amazing pictures. So that's not necessarily a critique, because obviously you guys only had a few minutes to just start to open up some questions. But I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about the uses of theory, and more generally the question of kind of the normative political motivation or practical motivation for mobilizing the kinds of techniques that you're mobilizing.
Yes.
Sure.
I'm sorry, in 20 minutes I couldn't show you any of my professional practice projects that might answer that question better, but in general, my work starts from a deliberative democracy point of view, and so I do a lot of stakeholder participation in simulation modeling. And for example, I'm doing a big project in the Florida Everglades that has all of the parties interested in conservation in Florida at the table. And they're not only at the table discussing things, they're engaging with simulation modeling systems describing alternatives and evaluating them. And so from the theory point of view, what I'm interested in is how we can get deliberative democracy to be informed by both design and science. And there's been a lot of work about public participation, obviously, and you're coming from a planning school, there's 30 years of work in that. Most of it is silent in terms of the role of information in those discussions. So there's a lot of work about who you get to the table and how, not much work about what they're doing when they're sitting at the table. And my approach is to get people around maps, which are well-known boundary objects between disciplines. So a map lets an engineer be comfortable talking to a citizen because the engineer is seeing the engineering diagram and the citizen seeing their house and their neighbor and their street. So I think that we can get a lot farther with the project of engaging people with environmental design with these concepts. But the other take on your question, which is a rougher one, and I go back to John's example, those of us that deal with a lot of data a lot of the time and do a lot of spatial analysis always come up with unforeseen patterns. And there's a really interesting design question to me in there, what's the theory behind the pattern that you show in your work? Well, you have a preconceived idea or you wouldn't be looking for it at all, but along the way, and the deeper you go, the more often you're surprised by what you find in the data. And that's particularly true of the new cell phone data. And my reaction to that is I love a lot of the work that looks at sense of place, but how people are now using places. And that combination, to give a pitch for a colleague at MIT, Carlo Ratti, did a study called Real-Time Rome, in which he looked at how tourists and how local residents use the city of Rome over time. And of course it's different. And you can even look where they engage with each other. So I think that we have some long-standing constructs and assumptions about places and how they're used. And then we have this data stream coming at us that is like drinking from a fire hose. So if you don't have any theory, you don't know even how to approach it. On the other hand, given any particular purchase that you start at, if you do a cluster analysis on data, you don't know what clusters are going to emerge. There's not a theory that's behind the clusters. So I think there has to be a kind of exploratory mode of this playing with the data, basically, and there has to be a more deliberative mode. And I think both of those perspectives are really needed, for instance, in the telecom data, because we have a lot of social theory about how people interact with their groups, for instance. Now we have a lot of evidence about how they do and don't, and indeed with globalization it's changing. So I think we need to be fairly pragmatic and recognize that the theoretical constructs are going to be adjusted to the data is going to inform new theory, and hopefully it'll be a nice, productive conversation.
Just a question behind.
You want Gerald?
I actually want to follow up on that, although I had another question, but I was stimulated by what Neil said. Are we asking too much of you guys and anybody else who presents today to not only know the technical stuff to the extent you do, but to also, of course, have a theory of data, because that's necessarily there, but then also to have a theory of how you're going to instrumentalize this data or how other people are going to instrumentalize it? Is that just putting too much of a burden on one individual to be a genius in all of those categories? I mean, I obviously think it is, although if it isn't, gee, I'd love to have that person nearby. That's a real question.
Yeah.
So you just answered the question. That's non-rhetorical.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting challenges we have, for instance, the sort of the trivial, the idea of the star architect, the person who comes in and somehow has this, I know everything that I need to know, and I can design a solution in one go that'll somehow work. One of the things I didn't discuss is that for the kind of thing that I do, I came to urban planning via IT consulting, and I mean that's not a usual route, if you will. And so I think there's a need I think we need to help people who are involved in space become more comfortable with data. I don't think it's fair to expect, an architect to understand, normalization of databases. So, but I think it does mean that the composition of a working group that's sort of trying to address a solution. I mean, Mike talks about having your engineer and your hydrologist and your client, all working together. And I think that kind of small team where people have the skills but have, the shared semantics in a sense to know what they're talking about and kind of develop those solutions together in an integrated and very clearly iterative way. And I think that also comes back to what you were saying about theory versus data. I don't think, neither side has the answer. So data without theory is just play. Theory without data is sort of castles in the sky. And I think what's interesting now is that we're at a point where, this field, to my mind, the kind of sort of the big data, open data field is really in its infancy. I think, in fact, we don't yet have it's so open that there's as yet no shared vocabulary or shared understanding of what this data does mean. People are trying to make those links, and that's what makes it so exciting to me, I think.
Peter.
Yeah, so the question I was going to ask John is did you begin with a data set or did you begin with a question? Which I think is some version of Neil's question as well. But in listening to that discussion, I begin to wonder if we don't get into trouble by posing it on those terms as theory versus data. It seems to me there are a number of fields at this university that deal with methodology. and among which is statistics is a good example. I don't think, they may begin with questions of methodology, and you may want to call that theory, but basically they're not looking at, they don't begin with questions about problems in the world to address, as much as with methodologies that might be used to address a host of different kinds of problems. And so if we're going to pose, set things up in this sort of a dichotomous tension between theory and data, it seems to me we leave out this issue of methodology. And so John, I am interested in the fact, I know a lot of people are interested in telecom data.
Yeah.
And did you begin with the telecom data, or and see what you could do with it, or did you begin with a set of design questions that you thought only telecom data would speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I had a long-standing interest in telecommunications and the effect that it was having on the way that people coordinated action. And I've always been deeply interested in sort of industrial location, but I think clearly also applies at the level that people are arranging to meet up for the evening for a night out, or kind of how people navigate a space. But so I had this long-standing interest, and then kind of did maybe this is the way PhDs in Britain work. I went to see my supervisor, and he said, "Oh, great question. Here's a list of reading." And so I went away and I did a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, trying to understand kind of what's the state of play in this field, in the field of sort of location theory, and then said, actually, telecommunications, I think, is the way to answer this question because of the impact that it's having on the way that people coordinate and sort of think about space. And then I feel like I actually spent about 4 years or 3 and a bit years doing what was essentially a sales job, which was going around to different companies and saying, please let me have your data. I think I can do some interesting stuff with it. So the predisposition was there. Without that data, I think I would have had a very different research output. So there was a serendipity in there that was very fortunate.
Just maybe want to follow up on something that Peter you were saying, because I think it's really relevant in terms of the broader issues of not just GIS, but really opening up the conversation around questions of representation, around questions of method in some way. One of the things that I think we do in school is probably a slightly different version of how you describe this idea of methodology. Because, for example, if you look at the history of drawing, and you look at the history of something like axonometric drawing, even though it's a method that can be used by different people to do different things, it's also it's a particular mode of representation that has a very particular ideology deeply embedded within its practices of doing axonometric drawing, because it's from a certain perspective. It's about the notion of the objectification of the thing, and therefore there is a direct relationship between the method and, in a sense, the value systems of that method. So I don't know if the question is the question of theory versus method, but that every method has, in some ways, certain consequences. And so if we're looking at GIS or geographic systems today, in the context of a university, we're also looking for the research opportunities and therefore what I would call the creative potentials, the way in which these methods act as catalysts for new forms of imagination that must be there. I mean, clearly, lots of methods are open to be utilized in multiple ways, which is unpredictable, and part of the advantage of them is their openness. But nevertheless, they do have, historically, very specific conditions, theories, ideologies built into them to some degree. And I think that reciprocity between the two is relevant if one is, for example, in our case, if we're seeking to establish a research platform or some kind of domain, because it actually will impact our choices. Otherwise, we will just have to sort of leave it to the openness of multiple possibilities. And I think trying to define things in a more sort of configurational sense of what are the consequences of this way versus that way, I suspect will be important for us just because of what we know from the history. I mean, we're not so familiar with GIS, but I think from what we know about the history of perspective versus history of axonometric drawings and so on and so forth. And I think GIS is now a new version of axonometric drawing, or is a new version of perspective drawing to some degree, because of the relationship between ideas and methods of representation. I mean, just for us to discuss.
John, you
Could I
want
just,
something?
one quick comment. I think what you said about sort of methods having an underlying theory or rhetoric is really interesting, because essentially I'm, in a sense, my area is based upon the presumption that, you know, behavior can tell us something that attitudes, people's expressed attitudes cannot. But there's also assumption that the data captures the entirety of the system. And clearly, this does not give me the people who walk to work. It does not give me the people who don't use the phone to communicate, whether because they're isolated or because they use some other mode of interaction. And I think, so for me, there's an interesting, again, it's not a dichotomy, it's an interesting discussion that needs to be had about how do we, you know, the data can tell us a lot of new, really exciting things, the behavior can tell us things. How do we capture the people who fall through the cracks as well and include that in sort of design solutions and kind of bring those two together? So just in my little domain, please.
Please.
So I have a little bit different take, maybe more technical on representation, in that my sense of what made GIS important and what keeps it important is that the magic of geographic glue has gotten us a long way. And you know, that's Cartesian if you want to put a theory around it. But it's actually broader than that, because if you don't like Cartesian geography, you can probably, as some of our next speakers will show us, you can warp space and time. And yet you still, if you want to go between disciplines and integrate information between widely disparate points of view, need to figure out how those things are going to join back together. And I think one of the things that GIS, for better or worse, gave us that a lot of CAD and design tools didn't, was that it played well between professions. And we have a lot of other design tools at our disposal, but they tend to do better in the domain of idiosyncratic representation. And so I think the tough thing is representation to designers is very personal. It's a way, it's not just a method, it's a way of thinking. And it's not just a way of thinking, it's a way of thinking through things for yourself. If you try and impose a method on that phase of design, you'll get a lot of pushback for good reason. On the other hand, design is a big, long process, and once it gets out of the first person's head and needs to get over to one other person's head, then you've got a communication model. And my assumption is always that you should be cautious about assuming your representation is going to be interpretable by somebody else. And the digital representations are no different there than pencil sketch. The advantage that they have, however, is that you don't need to choose a single representation. And so that's the thing I was trying to get at with separating semantics from representation, is that it's not making the problem necessarily easier. Now you have a problem with semantics and representation. But nonetheless, you can share semantics and disagree about representations. Or you can share representations and disagree about semantics. So we can both be looking at a tree and thinking about it completely differently. So it's not clear which way the digital tool should go, but it is clear to me that we need to be prepared for multiple representations. And that's one of the real wonderful advantages of digital tools, is that we don't have to pick as exclusively as we used to. But that said, we now have 1,000 things to pick amongst and no theory to help us choose. So that's the current dilemma.
So on that topic of 1,000 things to choose between, brings us to the status, in a way, linking some of the recent comments, the status of GIS within schools of design. So in addition to the idea that each method may bring its own ideological baggage, we now have 4 decades or more of a history of a particular discourse set of practices. And so the next panel will be looking both at the contexts for critical reception and ex post facto theorization of those practices, but also contemporary cultural forms that are occupying them. So we're going to take a break now for 15 minutes, and we'll be getting in at 3 o'clock.